Hi there, boys and girls. Glad to see you again. This is going to be our last lesson until after the holidays. Christmas and New Year's is coming up, and so we're going to take 2 weeks off for that, and we'll be back in the first Wednesday of January. But we got a couple good lessons for you today, and we'll get into that in a minute. I just want to welcome you all here. Thank you for joining me once again for story time with Mr. Brian. We're working off of our Promises of God storybook. We've been talking about Moses, and we've seen him grow from a little baby and into a man. He sinned, he ran away, but then he came back, and now he's talking with the Pharaoh, trying to get the Pharaoh to release the people from Egypt. So we got two more stories for you today. So let's get into our first story, and then we'll have some singing time, and then the second story. God will judge those who hurt his people. Plagues of promise. Pharaoh's heart was hard toward God. God's people were suffering. He had heard their prayers for help and was going to rescue them. Moses had been sent to warn Pharaoh, but Pharaoh had refused to obey God's command and let God's people leave Egypt so they could worship him. Now it was time for the consequences. God told Moses to meet Pharaoh as he was going to the river early in the morning. The river, or one of the creeks or ponds that came from it, was where everyone got their drinking water and bath water. They didn't have sinks and faucets like we have today. So if there was water to drink or use, it came from the ground. God told Moses to tell Pharaoh that by this sign he would know that Moses brought the word of the Lord. Moses obeyed God by telling Pharaoh everything God had commanded him. And then Aaron did as God commanded and struck the water of the river with his staff. Immediately the whole river turned into blood. Aaron then took his staff and stretched out his hand over all the waters of Egypt, and they all turned to blood. The people did not have water for drinking, or cooking, or bathing. All the fish in the water died, and it stunk. Boy, did it stink. Plus, a huge river with flowing blood instead of flowing water is absolutely disgusting. This was Egypt's first punishment because Pharaoh was disobeying God. God called this punishment and the ones that were still to come plagues. A plague is a really bad situation that overtakes a lot of people. Because Pharaoh was the leader of his people, his heart being hard toward God meant that his disobedience toward God led to lots of other people suffering too. And here we have a picture of Aaron turning the river into blood. But it didn't end with the water turning into blood. A week later, Pharaoh's heart was still hard, and the people of Egypt were digging in the dirt, trying to find water to drink, when the second plague struck. Pharaoh had again refused to let God's people go, despite God's warning him that he was going to send a plague of frogs. Now that might sound sort of funny. A bloody river is gross, for sure, but frogs can be fun and cute, right? Well, these frogs weren't funny or cute because they were everywhere. They came into bedrooms and beds and bowls when people were trying to eat. They climbed up dresses and hopped all over everyone. They were all over the place, all the time. But Pharaoh still said no. And this cycle went on for weeks. Moses and Aaron would go to Pharaoh and tell him God said to let his people go so they could worship him. Pharaoh would say no, and God would send another plague. Sometimes Pharaoh would say he would let the people go to get relief from the plague, but then the hard-hearted Pharaoh would show he was just lying after God brought that relief. After the frogs, it was gnats, tiny little bugs that filled the air as well as their noses, ears, and mouths. Then after the gnats were flies, a larger version of gnats that swarmed and buzzed everywhere. Still Pharaoh's heart stayed hard. For the fifth plague, all the Egyptian animals died. But the animals that God's people owned lived. Another week went by, and the sixth plague was big blisters that covered the skin of all the Egyptians. The blisters were painful and oozing with grossness, but still Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. Then God had Moses go back to Pharaoh and remind him that because he would not let God's people go, God was going to show his power to all people through all the plagues. And there we have all the frogs hopping everywhere. There were a lot more frogs than there were in this picture, believe me. Again, Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. So a seventh plague came, a powerful, dangerous, and majestic plague of thunder and lightning like no one had ever seen. With it came chunks of hail that pounded the fields and trees and animals and people with its power. Yet still Pharaoh's heart was hard towards God, and he would not let his people go. The eighth plague was locusts everywhere, eating the grain and all the trees and filling the Egyptian homes. Yet still Pharaoh's heart was hard. Then came the ninth plague, darkness. When Moses followed God's command and stretched out his hand toward heaven, there was complete darkness for 3 days everywhere the Egyptians lived. But the light remained where God's people lived. Moses went again to Pharaoh to plead with him to let God's people go, but Pharaoh sent him away again, refusing to give in because of the hardness of his heart. Pharaoh was hurting God's people, and God would keep bringing judgment on him because of it. God told Moses there was one more plague to come, and then Pharaoh would let God's people go. This plague was going to be the worst of them, and when you hear about it, it may remind you of Isaac and Abraham, as well as stories you've heard about Jesus. But the story of that last plague is for next time. And so for now, be thankful that God has not sent a bed full of frogs or gnats to your house. And here we have one of the plagues, the lightning and the thunder. So what did God tell Moses to tell Pharaoh to do? That's right, to let God's people go. And why wouldn't Pharaoh do what God wanted him to do? Because Pharaoh had a hard heart. And what were some of the plagues God sent to Egypt? You remember we talked about 9 of them so far. Right. And which plague do you think was the worst? Which one do you not want to have to happen to you? Okay, those are good answers, kids. All right. We are going to music time with Miss Lorilyn, so enjoy the music and then come back and we'll have the next story and we'll talk about the 10th plague, which is probably the worst of them all. So come back and we'll have another story.
Hi everyone, thanks for the story, Brian. Are you kids ready to praise God with our songs together? Let's get started. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. In an altar, love the Lord your God. Share love, love, oh love the Lord your God. Rose and Winston, love the Lord your God. Bentley and Raven, love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. Trinity, Anna, love the Lord your God. Fitzy and Owen, love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. Joey and Brian, love the Lord your God. Lorilyn and everyone, love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. Love, 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 oh love the Lord your God. God said love is patient. God said love is kind. God said love is patient, love is kind. God said love is patient. God said love is kind. God said love is patient, love is kind. Make yourself small and whisper, love is patient, love is kind. Sit up and clap your hands and say it, love is patient, love is kind. Raise your to the sky and sing it, love is patient, love is kind. God said love is patient, God said love is kind. God said love is patient, love is kind. God says love is patient, God says love is kind. God said love is patient, love is kind. Make yourself small and whisper, love is patient, love is kind. Sit up and clap your hands and say it, love is patient, love is kind. Reach up to the sky and sing it, love is patient, love is kind. Have your scarves ready? All right. Here's mine. Okay. You might see people do this with them. You know that's not what we're going to do. Here we go. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm going to let it shine. Hide it under a bushel, no, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Won't let Satan put it out, I'm going to let it shine. Won't let Satan put it out, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Good job. When I'm outside playing in the yard, I can talk to God, I can talk to God. When I'm inside resting in my bed, I can talk to God, I can talk to God. I can tell God all about my day, ask Him to help me to live in His way. Then I love you is what I say, 'cause I can talk to God anytime. When I'm at home and I can't play with my friends, I can talk to God, I can talk to God. When I'm at home and I cannot go to church, I can talk to God, I can talk to God. I can tell God all about my day, ask Him to help me to live in His way. Then I love you is what I say, 'cause I can talk to God anytime. I can talk to God anytime. I can talk to God anytime. Well, let's get finished up. Here we go. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he first loved me. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he first loved me. Here we go. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he first loved me. Bye. See you next time.
Well, hi there. Welcome back. I'm glad you enjoyed music time. Thank you, Miss Lorilyn, for leading us in worship with the music. I do appreciate this every week. So we had just talked about the 9 plagues that covered Egypt and the Egyptian people, and now we come up to the 10th plague, which is the worst of them all, and we'll see what happens here. God will save his people through the blood of a spotless lamb, the Passover promise. God had sent 9 plagues to Egypt because of Pharaoh's refusal to let God's people go. Pharaoh's heart was hardened toward God, and although his own people were suffering from these plagues, he would not give in. But God knew what would change his heart, and this had always been God's plan. God told Moses to go to Pharaoh again and tell him that if he did not let God's people go that day, at midnight, all the firstborn males in all of Egypt would die. The firstborn male animal from each mother animal, the firstborn son from the Egyptian farmer, the firstborn son from the Egyptian rulers. On and on it would go. In all of Egypt, for all living animals and people, the firstborn son would be killed that very night, unless Pharaoh let God's people go. Pharaoh was told this, and he had a firstborn son, but still his heart was hardened toward God. He sent Moses and Aaron away, refusing to let God's people go. But this plague was different. There was a promise for God's people in it. God told Moses to tell all his people that they needed to sacrifice a spotless, perfect boy lamb that evening and then paint the doorposts of each of their houses with the blood of that lamb. They would then all gather together that night and feast on the meat from the animals they had sacrificed, thanking God for his provision and trusting him with what he was about to do. Then they were to be dressed for travel, sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands, with the blood of the lamb painted on their doorposts. And here we have a picture of a father painting the doorpost with blood. A plague of death would go through that land that night, but God promised that it would pass over anywhere there was a doorpost covered with the blood of the spotless boy lamb. So all of the Egyptians' firstborn children would be killed, but all God's people would be saved. They would be protected from the plague of death. God's people did just as Moses instructed them to do. And just as he always does, God did exactly what he said he would do. It was not yet morning when there was screaming and crying like no one had ever heard through all of Egypt, as family members woke up and discovered that their fathers, or sons, or brothers had been killed. Any who were the firstborn. Yet it was silent in the homes of God's people, as not one person had died. God's people knew they would always remember that night as the night God protected them by having death pass over their homes. They would call it the Passover, and it would remind them always of how God kept his promise to save them through the blood of a perfect lamb. So it was a celebration for God's people, but for Pharaoh, it was a definite punishment. And here it is at nighttime throughout Egypt. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron at once. He told them to take God's people, all their belongings and all their animals, and go. He told them to be gone and asked God to bless him. The Egyptians were eager for God's people to leave too. When God had told his people to ask the Egyptians for gold and silver, they gave God's people all they had. And so that very day, even without time to cook food for the journey, God's people all gathered together, and Moses and Aaron led them out of Egypt. God had spoken from a burning bush and told Moses that he would get his people out of Egypt. God had said that his greatness would be shown even though Pharaoh's heart was hard. God had told Moses that he would be able to lead the people and that they would listen. It had been difficult and scary at times, and it had definitely been gross at times. But God had always done exactly what he had promised. He had saved his people through the blood of a lamb, and now it was time for them to begin the journey to the land he had promised them. And here's Pharaoh telling Moses and Aaron to leave, to get out and take God's people with. So what was the last plague God sent to Egypt? The plague of death of the firstborn child, firstborn male, firstborn son. What did God tell his people to do so that this plague wouldn't happen at their houses? That's right, to kill a lamb, and then a boy lamb, and then paint the door with the blood of that lamb. And how do you think God's people felt as they were packing their things to leave Egypt? You think they were happy to leave? Happy to get out of Egypt? See what God has in store for them? So, that is our story time for today. Like I said, next week is Christmas, and the week after that is New Year's. So we will not meet for 2 weeks. So come back in 3 weeks, and we'll have some more lessons. We will see where God's people go from as they leave Egypt, and what happens to them as they go towards the promised land that God had promised Abraham way back when. So, before we leave, we're going to have a quick prayer, and then Miss Lorilyn will sing our closing song again for us. So, fold your hands, bow your heads, close your eyes, kids, and we'll have a quick prayer. Dear God, thank you for always keeping your promises. Thank you for loving your children, even when we do something that is not right or not pleasing. You still love us, and you still promise to always love us. Help us to keep soft hearts towards you, God. Amen. Okay, kids, that is all the time we have for today. So be safe, be well, and remember, God always loves you. Goodbye.
Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he first loved me. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he first loved me. Here we go. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Because he first loved me. Bye. See you next time.